So I very much thank everyone for being here in this second session. This is a collaboration between the Global Peatland Initiative, and we are very happy to share with you the 25th anniversary of CIFOR. This is a year of celebrations. It's been 25 years of transformational action for impact. In collaboration with the partners that you see in the logo and with the Global Peatland Initiative, we wanted to offer you a bit of intertropical dialogue, a bit of zooming in on what are the lessons learned and the challenges of the countries in the tropic that have peat, how they are managing their peats for different purposes. And today we have an amazing array of speakers that will be talking about their experiences and the lessons learned from different perspectives. We have a lot of different angles. And just let me introduce myself. I am Rosa Roman, and I'm working for CIFOR. I'm working in peats, and I'll be very happy also to introduce in the next slides a bit the context of this talk and why peatlands and why now, a bit what the thresholds and the threats are for peats in the next decades before I give the floor to the honorable speakers. So just to share with you, we have different angles today from different speakers. We have the honor, actually, of having Her Excellency Ibu Sita Nurbaya, who will be opening the session. And with her, there are other three colleagues from the Indonesian Republic. We have a representative from the Indonesian Agency of Restoration. We have Pak Budi Wardana, that will be explaining the experiences of the Restoration Agency, all the challenges and all the successes that they've been going through, so that other countries can also learn about the difficulties and the way forward in this topic of restoration. We will have the private sector, so we have a nice combination of public and private sector. And then from the private sector, we have Pak Resal Kumsapmadja, sorry about that. And he is the Chief Operating Officer of the RMU, which is the company that is under the Katingan Mentaya project, which is an ecosystem restoration concession, a very large one, 150,000 hectares under restoration, a major challenge, and all under a private concession. So a lot of lessons learned from that. And the third person from Indonesia that will be speaking after Ibu Siti will be Pak Gots Martin, which is going to offer us the very important point of view of the private sector from an agribusiness that is working on palm oil plantations in peats. What are the challenges of sustainability? Because as much as we might like or dislike the advance of peatland, of palm oil plantations, we all contribute. We all are consumers of palm oil. So I think it's very useful to have in the view of the private sector with Gots. So let me start also, sorry. Also, we have very important representatives of the Peruvian government, because we frequently talk about Indonesia when we talk about tropical peats. But we will see in the next slides that we have so much more in the peat in the tropics that we previously realized. Peru, and in general, the Amazon region is one of the areas in the tropics that is holding much more tropic than previously anticipated. So we will have Dr. Alberto Paniagua, which is the prior executive director of Profonampe. And this is also a very interesting angle, because it's a private it's the private vision of, and it's the largest trust fund of Peru, and the first national institution accredited by the Green Climate Fund in Latin America. So Profonambe is the Peruvian trust fund for natural parks and protected areas. We will have the view of the private sector on how to manage protected areas, and in this case, the areas of Pastaza Marañón, which is the largest peat, most extensive and deep peats in the northern part of Peru. Peru has peats in other regions, but this is the largest tropical lowland peats in the Quito region. Then we will have Denise del Castillo, which is a researcher, so we also have the view of academia and the view of the research organizations. And he is the program director for forest management and environmental services at the Peruvian Amazon Research Institute, which is has a biological research station in Genaro Herrera, a beautiful place to visit. I encourage you all to go and see that part of the world. Amazing, amazing peats up there as well. And amazing management challenges we will be seeing today with the aguajales, these palm swamp areas. And then, the last but not the least, we have a fantastic experience of how to make money out of ecotourism in peatlands in Africa. We have the case study of Botswana. Botswana has the river delta, which is an amazing touristic destination. Not all of it is peat. It's mainly a wetland, but part of it has peats, and some of the challenges are related similarly to how to manage wetland and wetland ecosystems. We will have Professor Joseph Baiwa, which is the director of the Okavango Research Institute, and we will have Dr. Peter Wolski, which is a senior researcher at the Climate System Analysis at the University of Cape Town. So thanks a lot for all our speakers. I will introduce a session of this, the context of this session, which, as it was presented before, is about lessons learned on best management practices for peatland areas in the tropics for different purposes. So how could we best manage peats when we're looking for conservation goals, but also when we're looking for agribusiness productivity, where we are looking for restoration action. Okay, so all these topics are going to be presented today, and I hope this can offer some thoughtful discussions and add some uncertainty, actually, into the complexity of managing peats. Very quickly, we're going to go then to the context of this session, which basically I want to highlight a bit what my colleague Hans Josten did on a bit what are the challenges of peats in the tropics for the next decades. And very briefly, go through three main questions. Why peatlands and why now? What are the threats of peats in the next decades, and what could be the next steps? And the next step, naturally, are going to lead us to the International Tropical Peatland Center, which is like the road that takes us to a coordinated action on supporting peatland management at the South-South. So, Justin was showing his maps on peatland distribution. I'd like to mention that in the last 2 years, there have been fruitful research on peats in the tropics. We produce certain maps about new distributions of peats in the tropical areas that suggest that there is at least 3 more times more peats in the tropics than we previously thought. That brings a lot of management complications. Having peats is a responsibility. And in this map, basically, you see in red colors areas with high stocks of carbon. Those are megagrams of carbon per hectare. These values come from ISRIC, which is a department at the University of Wageningen that does soil organic carbon contents through mapping approaches. And in black, you see the areas that Gumbrich's map has suggested as areas that could have peat. What is interesting about this map is not only that we have much more peat than previously expected in the tropics, which I'm sure Dr. Justin could also agree, but it's also that we have different types of peats. Someone mentioned before that Indonesia has swamp peats, but areas, for instance, like Okavango, these are flood-out swamps. So it's a completely different hydrological dynamic, and this also requires different management approaches. We also see that we have peats that are related to riverine ecosystems, like the Amazon. I think the colleagues will talk about all these aguajales that are created in abandoned lakes, that the rivers change and shift direction, and they lift all these new areas that accumulate organic matter over a millennium. So we have at least 4 different types of peats, but also what we have seen is that besides these well-known deep and extended peatlands, like in Indonesia, or like in the Cubet Central, or like in the parts of the northern Peru, Iquitos, we also have labile, or maybe the pronunciation is labile, peats, which basically is a different type of peat. It's much more patchy, is less steep, and is much more vulnerable to climate variations and to the reductions in water table and temperature. And this is a bit what we've seen in the Amazon. All these black dots represent areas that are very small, but that could potentially have peat. So they are not extended, they are not deep, they are superficial and patchy. And this requires also a different type of management. One area that we are particularly worried about is the northern headwaters of the the Rio Negro in Brazil, which is a very wet area, and that suffers a lot the effects of El Niño, and it suffers a lot of fire. So in these fires in this region, where we can see all these black dot pots in the border between Venezuela and Brazil, whenever we have fire, we're burning peat, and this is not accounted in the national greenhouse gas inventories, and we still don't necessarily know what could happen in terms of management or what could be done with this type of much more vulnerable, patchy distribution of peat deposits. The second question is also related to why peats, not only because there is much more and because it's diverse, but also because we are missing a lot of peats. I think we can agree that we really need to work all together to create maps of peatlands that not only incorporate the lowlands, but also the mountain peats. We are missing completely mountain peats. I've been working for more than 10 years in the peatlands of the Andes. There is a lot of sphagnum peat at that areas that are suffering from fire every year. Okay, so there is much more peat in the tropics at both the lowlands and the mountain areas. And why is this important? Not because we don't really know if it's 3% of the global area and 50% of the total emissions, but what is important is because they are carbon relevant. When we look at the GAP report, and this is from 2017, we see that if we want to be on track for the 2 degrees Celsius commitment, we are out of that track. We need to reduce our emissions between 11 and 13.5 gigatons of CO2 equivalent to really be on the pathway of the 2-degree target. And this is not really yet incorporating peats. So peats really need to start working. Countries with peats need to start incorporating their peats into mitigation target. And there is a lot of capacity building associated to that. A lot of the reasons why countries don't necessarily incorporate them into mitigation action is because they don't necessarily know where they are and they don't know how to do baselines. And then they don't have emission factors to incorporate them into the greenhouse gas inventory. So capacity building and experience of Indonesia in that regard would be heavily useful. So, and I think it's very important to understand that these stocks of carbon on the ground are carbon bombs. They are carbon relevant. Under changing conditions, they will be released and they will contribute to mitigation, to climate change. So it's important to keep them wet. It's important to manage them properly. What are the threats? The threats are diverse. We will start with climatic threats. We know the climate is changing. Global warming is changing the moisture contents in the atmosphere. And this is an example of an analysis that we are running right now to see what is the overlapping of long-term trends in rainfall with the location of peats. This is the dry season % rainfall trend change between 1960 and 2010, and these are significant areas of change. In brown, you have areas that are drier than normal. In blue, you have areas that are wetter than normal. And this is only in the dry season. We could show the same graph for the wet season, but with different distributions of rainfall patterns, okay? So what is going to happen in areas where the dry conditions are already significant if there is peat? How is rainfall going to affect the stability of these very fragile ecosystems? These are questions that need more research. Also, what is the effect of temperature? We always talk about El Niño. We always talk about the effect of rainfall on the stability of peat. But we've been observing in Indonesia that some of the major last fire seasons, and that could be 2016, were not necessarily related to an anomalous rainfall condition, but to a heat wave. So temperature is now going to be leading fire much more than rainfall is. And we need much more research on the role of changing temperatures in different tropical regions and their effect on the stability of the peatland stock. Also, new challenges. We've been discussing this in the previous session. These are anthropogenic challenges. These peatlands frequently are interesting for extractive action. Western Amazonia is absolutely rich in oil and gas. Ecuador, Peru, Venezuela, all of them have a lot of peat and all of them have a lot of oil that is not yet being extracted. Concessions are there already. And this is an example of Pastaza Marañón, northern Peru, Iquitos region. You have in orange the plantations, many of them for pulp, wood, and some of them for oil palm, but oil palm is coming to the Peruvian Amazon as well. And in pink and in red, you have these oil lots. And some are there already under exploration, some are under production, and this is going only to increase in the next decades. So there is a lot of extractive concessions on the Peruvian Amazon as well as in Ecuador. Yeah, I think there is this reserve, the Llanu, that it's been just announcing that they are going to start exploration there as well. So this is a common problem, and it was interesting to hear before that there are solutions for that. The same for the Cuvette Central. This is the peatlands of the border between the two Congos. And you can here see all the logging concessions that have been already accepted. And then you have the oil palm concessions that are already operating. And the same for extractive activities. We have hydrocarbon blocks already concessed and mining concessions over these peats. Can we deny development to countries with peat? No, we can't, but we need to make an effort to have the best management practices and to learn lessons of what could be working and what would not work, so that then we don't have to go back and feel sorry that we didn't do it a different way. So this is a global responsibility, because we cannot deny development to these countries. Also, more important about peats is that we are forced to manage peats locally, but this is a global commodity. This is a global commodity that we all consume every single day in shampoos, in food, in creams. Oil palm is part of our daily lives. And there is a lot, and there has to be a lot of pressure on the producers. But there is also a big responsibility on the consumers. And we have the pleasure to having Pat Götz today, Götz Martin, that will be all explaining us a bit about the standards and the best practices that the private sector are implementing, the round tables on sustainable palm oil, and how this helps to preserve peats that are going under agribusiness concession. So it's a common responsibility because this is a global commodity. And then the last thing, which is frequently the elephant on the table, we wouldn't have mining concessions, we wouldn't have logging concessions, we wouldn't have palm oil global commodities going all around the world if we didn't have consumers. And consumers and population growth are really, really part of the key to solve. All the policies that have to do with any type of natural resource also have to look at family planification. This is a very interesting visual globy description of the contribution of different parts of the world in terms of population. We see that in the early 1800s, Asia was the very center of world population. But we see in this projection of 2100, which is basically focusing on a trajectory of 11 billion people. We are right now 7 billion people, so 11 is quite conservative. There are projections that go between 11 to 25. And what we see is that Asia still has a big part in the world population, but is decreasing. And the one that is really increasing is Africa. Okay? So I think I wouldn't want to be a politician who has to be in charge of the health and in charge of education of a population that triples every 50 years. This leads to ingovernability, not having the right. It's impossible to have a rights policy that focuses on sustainability when population growth is so high. So these are some of the issues that will be covered today. And I'm absolutely delighted then to say that the discussion of this event will be on how to transform, it will be dealing with these topics, how to transform all these uncertainties, climatic, economic, population growth into sustainable management practices. What is the key formula to incorporate all these factors in the sustainability of peatlands? And also how can we create robust policies to protect peat? And I think one of the solutions in this direction is to promote this intertropical South-South dialogues. And this is what the International Tropical Peatland Center is going to offer the opportunity to. It's countries that suffer similar problems that are going to talk to each other on how they've approached the legal context, the technical context, the capacity building context. And in this sense, this Peatland Center is offering a great opportunity for one very important future problem. Thank you very much. And then we're going to start with our first honorable speaker, which will be Her Excellency Ibu Siti Nurbaya, which is the Minister of Environment and Forestry of the Republic of Indonesia. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, honorable speakers, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is my honor again to have this opportunity to convey my remarks at the South-South Dialogue on the management of tropical peatlands. I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to the Global Landscape Forum for facilitating this meeting, which allows Indonesia to share experiences in peatland management, especially in search of best practices for peatland management and fire prevention while improving communities' livelihoods, socio-economy, and gender equity. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, as regards the history of utilization in the early 20th century, Indonesian peatlands were mostly for subsistence agriculture and conducted through traditional practices and resulting in sustainability relatively. Subsequently, in 1960s, the Indonesian government included peatland in the transmigration program and for logging concessions. In 1990s, the government introduced industrial forest plantation and agricultural estates. The extensive promotion of this industry has degraded almost half of Indonesia's peatland, which are most located in Sumatra and Kalimantan. In our record, not less than 4.5 million hectares of the private concession area since 1990 are on peatlands. The further utilization of the degraded peatland for plantation unfortunately has also contributed to massive peat fire and carbon emission in 2015, which have caused huge environmental as well as economic and social deterioration. Learning from these experiences, Indonesian government then took corrective measures with several policies reflecting our commitment in improving our peatlands to support sustainable development in Indonesia and in taking a significant role with global climate actions. Our strong commitment to the improvement of peatland management in Indonesia can be seen from our policy in suspending permit issuance for new application in the primary forest and peatland utilization, known as moratorium. This started in 2011 and emphasized by following up the moratorium to prevent the degradation of peatland and to improve the quality of their management through regulation on the protection and management of the peat ecosystem in 2014, which was then regulated stronger in 2016. This pair of government regulation are now being further implemented through the issuance of an operational procedures, standards, and guidelines by the Ministry of Environment and Forestry Regulation. All of these regulations together establish a much firmer and clearer legal basis for the protection of peat ecosystem. The government regulation of 2016 in particular sits the protection function of peat ecosystem is based on the fact that they protect and preserve water balance, store carbon, and conserve biodiversity. This regulation reinforced government policy related to peatland governance through identifying, cultivating, and protected peatland areas, applying better cultivation practices for drained peatland using proper hydrological techniques and management, improving cultivation practices for smallholders, restoring degraded peatland through natural succession as well as revegetation, scrutinizing licensed peatlands, and continuing law enforcement. On the ground, the Ministry of Environment and Forestry established areas of peatland hydrological zone, defining the peat domes and deep peatlands to be protected, and requiring concession holders to revise their respective working plans to control protected peatland zones. Meanwhile, the non-protected or the cultivation peatland zone can be planted as usual. These measures have been positively responded by the private sector, and the commitment of concession holders can be seen. Our record says that about 177 concessionaries have already developed plans and implemented peat restoration until 2026, with the main objective of improving the hydrological function, particularly through canal blockage to control peatland drainage, canal backfilling, water pumping, and deep wells to keep the peatland wet. Moreover, of about 147 more concessionaries are under supervision for taking similar steps. Our techniques include water management at farm level, construction, operation, and maintenance, applying the traditional cultivation practice, revegetation, and natural succession. Those activities are the main support for peatland recovery. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, Indonesia is now developing modern and advanced technique in managing peatland and preventing fires. The inventory of Indonesia's peat ecosystem in the form of peat hydrological unit maps are developed, which are to be used as reference for more detailed mapping at the provincial and district or city level. These maps show that the total extent of Indonesia's peat ecosystem stands at 24.14 million hectares, of which around 9.16 million hectares are located in Sumatra, 8.39 million hectares in Kalimantan, 60,000 hectares in Sulawesi, and 6.53 million hectares in Papua. After conducting an inventory, an area of about 2.5 million hectares of peat ecosystem have been targeted by the government for restoration by 2020. This includes 0.7 million hectares for protected zone, 1.4 million hectares in licensed cultivation zone, and 0.4 million hectares in community cultivation zones. We believe that the use of more advanced technology will be able to provide more detailed map to support better management of peatland. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, the restoration of peat ecosystem in industrial zone is conducted by having a peat ecosystem restoration plan of each of concession holders to restore peat ecosystem in their concession areas. The document of 10 years plan comprises of steps on establishment of water table compliance point, places where water depth are to be measured manually or automatically, building rainfall monitoring stations, blocking canals with or without spillways, building of water gates and reservoirs, rehabilitation through replanting with endemic or indigenous plant species, as well as allowing for the reintroduction of natural succession. Establishment of water table compliance point as well as rules regarding the measurement of water depth at compliance point are stipulated both under the evaluation of company performance and since 1996 by the Ministry of Environment and Forestry itself as an additional criteria of the performance evaluation, or we call it proper, which has been conducted since 1996. The restoration of community cultivation zone is conducted through independent community programs promoting traditional practices is part of our degraded peatland restoration. Currently, innovative community-based approaches like Desa Peduli Gambut, peatland managed by villagers are in practice, which is developing governance structure based on the peat hydrological unit to ensure that peat domes are managed through ensuring a stable water level as a key scientific principle. Coherently, reduction of deforestation and peat degradation while promoting social forestry program is promoted as part of the efforts on peatland management under participatory villagers. Communities have made significant progress towards developing peat rewetting infrastructure, including wells drilling, canal blocking, and canal filling. Community peat rewetting activities have been conducted so far in areas covering 270,000 hectares. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, managing peatlands to provide livelihoods for local communities as well as to conduct intensive agriculture and forestry may contradict with the protection of the environment. The option includes whether to drain water in the peatland for plantation development or to avoid draining. Alternatives for economic activities in the wet peatland include paludiculture and agroforestry. Local communities had some experiences in paludiculture by utilizing tree species such as jalutung, belangiran, ramin, and gemor. Communities also utilize food from peatlands such as sagu and nipa. When peatland is actually drained for forestry and agriculture, an option that can be taken is practicing the land clearing without burning. This technique is required to prevent the use of fire. Fire for clearing plant remnants must be avoided, as litter of crop residues can be processed into several types of products such as compost, wood vinegar, and charcoal briquettes. Excellencies, participants, ladies and gentlemen, restoring our peatland is not only about improving biophysical aspect of peatland management, but also the livelihoods of communities living surrounding peatlands and the sustainability of business run by licensed companies. Thus, Ministry of Environment and Forestry is accelerating social forestry, though the timely introduction by policy reform, improve government regulation, and at the imposition of better controls at all levels. Underlining these efforts, the government has launched an equitable economic policy to reduce inequality starting in 2015. As a concluding remark, the main principle in peatland management is to keep the peatland wet. Peatland gives you opportunities for development with an appropriate treatment, particularly the hydrological function to keep the natural function of the peatland. Traditional practice is important in managing the peatland, as important as an approach for peatland restoration. The important step is to recognize the landscape and identify the peat dome and deep peatland, let's say 3 meters or more, to be protected. The current satellite technology and image interpretation and analysis is a proportional scale, as proportional scale is important and helpful for inventory, analysis, and planning. The social economy aspect parallel to the landscape unit inventory is a similarly important step. Soon we will hear lessons about best practices in peatland management that can be learned from distinguished speakers of this side event. I hope that we will have an inspiring discussion and thoughts about the future of our tropical peatlands. For your kind attention, I thank you.
Thank you very much to EBC2, which is clearly a champion in promoting restoration and peatland management. Interesting from your talk, Ibu, is it kind of caught my attention, these maps that need to be created to support better peatland management, and also the fact that we are creating new forms of governance, right? So governance around hydrological units. I think these are very interesting new challenges around not only technical, but also governance associated to that. Thank you very much. So the next speaker now is going to be Pak Budi Wadana, who is the head of the, sorry, let me get my notes, sorry. Is the head of the Agency for Planning and Cooperation from the Indonesian Peatland Restoration Agency. The floor is yours. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rosa. Terima kasih, Ibu. Mohon izin. So this is deep diving of what Ibu Menteri has previously mentioned in the opening. So next.
The green one is to go ahead and the red is to go back.
Okay, thank you. So as Ibu mentions, the peatland are the largest long-term carbon store in the terrestrial biosphere, as many previous speakers mentioned about that. But the sustainability issues is also a very complex challenge that requires involvement of and also determinations, as Ibu just shows, from early in the morning until this time, determinations to lead us all to do the restorations. So the data and information, scientific and technical inputs are limited at the time that we start to manage peatland for the productions area. The spatial data, such as the peatland maps, we don't have with the proportional scale. We have it in the indicative scale, but it's sometimes it's obsolete. But in the challenge of mapping, there's also still confusing terms used to determine what is peat as a soil, peatland as a landscape, or as an ecosystem. So a unit of management is required to put it as close as possible with the scientific background that we have. So as Ibu mentions that the peatland hydrological unit is the one that we choose as a management unit in Indonesia because that's a typical peatland in Indonesia. It just developed between the two rivers or rivers with the oceans, or maybe it's because of the old lake. It's dry up, swamp and lake that dried up, and the biomass is accumulated in those areas. And also there's issues on the restorations. What is required for the restorations? Is it a whole ecosystem restorations, whether or not it is a hydrological ecosystem or wider? And also the time scale. So that will lead to or limited the boundaries of approaches that we have, the scope of management, scale of the impact, and so on. So what is the definition of restoration and methodology to restore? There's a big question when we start the restorations as the President established Peatland Restoration Agency. All in all, we could not just sit and wait until all the debates on the terminology conclude with itself. So there's a role of the government to set aside, to make a framework of the policy and also regulations to do that. So it is timely that during PRG established, there's already government regulations, number 71, and then renewed in the 2016 with the regulations number 57. The Ministry of Environment and Forestry is also preparing a decree on how to implement those regulations from the survey, the methodology to survey, up to the monitoring and ensuring that all relevant stakeholders that dealing with the use of the peatlands should follow. There's a strong link is required between science and policy to ensure that policy objectives are based on data, or we calculate, we do the proper knowledge management. We could say that we should database all this science and policy. It should be clear and quantifiable. So within the 3 years of the operations of PRG, so our recommendation is still, even though we already have some information on that, we still have to identify priorities for peatland rewetting by assessing peatland distribution, drainage status, actual emissions, identifying biodiversity conservation hotspot in the peatland, formulate success criteria, and develop adequate indicators of successful peatland rewetting. To develop and implement, where applicable, adequate support and funding mechanism for changing drain peatland use to polyculture. As several times Ibu Menteri mentions about that, avoid and abolish preferred subsidies and regulations which drive peatland damage and destructions, and develop stronger regulatory mechanism, and communicate to the societal benefit of wet or both pristine and rewetted peatlands in terms of ecosystem services. So we use the other products of the ecosystem, such as ecosystem services, that sometimes it provides much more benefits than the current productions of biomass from the ecosystem. And also the cost arising from damaged peatlands. And then stimulating market-based mechanism to support peatland, as several speakers already mentioned before, putting not classifications, but it's a market approach such as certifications of sustainable use, engaging and supporting local communities, sharing experience, expertise on peatland conservation, restorations, and improved management. We put this as the approach as the social and community level using the Desa Peduli Gambut or Peat Care villages from the village level, and also engaging the private sectors to join us in developing the similar programs in the surrounding areas, and also promote the role of peatlands rewetting and restoration in reaching national and international policy target, especially for climate regulations, water quality, and biodiversity conservations. From all the points that I mentioned previously, it's also been mentioned by Ibu Menteri, the importance of having the international tropical peatland centers, and it's already been announced and it's already been established. This interim secretariat last month in Jakarta, and this ITPC will be seated in Bogor, next to Jakarta. So the Peatland Restoration Agency, actually, the President mandated the establishment of the Peatland Restoration Agency to accelerate recovery restorations of the degraded peatland and ensuring no more fire happens on those peatland. So the main task of BRG, or the Peatland Restoration Agency, is to coordinate, facilitate peatland restorations in the 7 provinces. While we have so many provinces in Indonesia with peatland, but the main target areas for BRG is only 7 provinces, from Riau, Jambi, South Sumatra, West Kalimantan, Central Kalimantan, South Kalimantan, and Papua. The mission is to plan, design, and carry out restoration of degraded peatland, while we also promoting their protections and wise management, strengthen the technical and financial cooperations on peatland restoration, coordinate and facilitate local government, communities, and other parties to carry out restorations of degraded peatlands. This also means that we have to mainstream the wise use of peatland, providing them with technical assistance and the required data, especially on the spatial data for the peatland, the extents, and also the current use of those peatland. We should also mobilize public, private, and people communities resources, participations, and partnership in the implementation of peatland restorations, and also facilitating action research, the research that could be brought into the activities to support the sustainable management of peatland ecosystems. I mentioned this, the 2 main framework conventions that dealing with the international target, but previously we also hear the presentations from Ramsar conventions, and it's not only the 3 conventions, but there are other conventions related to this peatland restorations. So what we do to accomplish the target, and what will we do to get there? Where, how big, whom, which technology, when, is part of what we do in the planning. We based our planning on the peatland mapping, research and development, and also other related government regulations, such as the spatial planning, the law on the regional governance, and then we start to do the constructions based on the planning, on the operations and maintenance, and also pick up or supported by the community and village capacity and resilience building, as Ibu Menteri mentioning about the Desa Peduli Gambut. And part of how we will know that we are making progress, and we should do the monitoring and evaluations of what we do. And in the scale of the peatlands in Indonesia, especially in the 7 provinces that BRG has the mandate to work on, we have more than 500 peat hydrological units in the 7 provinces, which cover area of 21.7 million hectares, in which on those peat hydrological units we have 12.9 million hectares as a peatland. And then there are mineral soils in the peat hydrological unit. Why this mineral soil is also important? Because those mineral soils are influenced or influencing the conditions of the peatland hydrological unit. some area of the peatlands already been accessed, or according to the land use law, it's already been designated as the cultivations or productions areas, as much as 10.1 million hectares, and 2.9 million hectares already declared as a protected areas. And from 10.1 million hectares, we already have concessions as big as 5.7 million hectares. It's not a concessions. I make a mistake in it. It's a productions area, in which the pulp and paper industrial plantations or concessions have 2.2 million hectares area. Timber extractions as HPH in Indonesia, we have 576,000 hectares, and palm oil plantations which have peatlands under the concessions as big as 539,000 hectares. And other land use, it's mostly the land that belong to the community or the village areas, the area under the management of people or non-concession areas. And then according to the decree of the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, through the moratorium decree, we have protections forests, 4.4 million hectares, and another addition to those that the protected areas is not supposed for the productions. So how we do the restoration implementation plan? We do the peatland mapping and inventory overlaid with land use. We do the stock taking of existing programs, concessions, policy, and activities related to the peatland and their objectives. And then we do the negotiations, we do the discussions, we do the roundtable focus group discussions to agree on party responsibilities for restorations based on the land use mapping and also based on the peatland degradation map and also existing management unit. And then establish necessary arrangement with the responsible third parties, including at least we do the feasibility study, cost analysis, design and constructions, and also detailed map and community engagement. This is part of the facilitating rules that PRG should do. And then doing the supervision and facilitations of restoration implemented by concession holders, the local community, the provincial government, and also the technical implementing unit of national government, such as the national park managers. And part of the responsibilities of the Ministry of Environment and Forestry is to strengthening the policy and providing data, information, technical assistance of all restoration guidelines at national and also provincial level. So this is how the map, the restoration map presented. The yellow is the areas that you are allowed to do the productions. The green one is on the intact peatland that are included in the moratoriums. The blue one are area that's supposed to be in the protection zone, but actually it's already have extensive canal system. And the red one, unfortunately, is the area that affected by forest and land fire. This is the deep dive on the one hydrological unit with all the informations of who's going to be responsible of doing the restoration on this area. And also, as the last part of my presentations on the developing the peatland restoration information and the monitoring system. It's critical to follow up progress on the peatland restoration effort, communicate and the result, report at national, regional, local, and even at the international level. The PRIMS, the Peatland Restoration Informations and Monitoring System, is developed to support complex restoration process, provide overview to wide range of key organizations, partnering through the collaborative effort, includes the development of interactive knowledge. So depends on what you need, you can click and it's an interactive and you can download the information as you deem required or as you deem necessary. The purpose of the development of the SPRIM is to communicate result and outcome, and also to encourage positive momentum, to inspire replication and allow for transferable result. to guide and support implementation restorations and provide feedback, including continuous and collective learning for adaptive management. We also need to ensure transparency because some of the effort that we do using the Development Partners Fund. So any development partners who would like to see where their resources implemented on and by whom and for how long and what is in the vicinity of their activities, and they could increase the impacts of their support by joining hands with other activities on the area. So this is the profile of the PRIMS. Why we develop PRIMS? Because we deal with the large area, we deal with multiple users and actors, we deal also with the multiple restorations interventions, and also we need to calculate the emissions reductions potential of the restorations. And the key features including peat degradation indications. So we could indicate, we could put a red flag if there's an illegal opening of peatlands, and 1 pixel represents 0.9 hectares. If there's area larger than 0.9 hectares, and the system could identify and give us a red flag on that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Budi, for showing us the complexity of what it means to do restoration at a national scale. I actually really like the fact that there has to be a very long process of clarifying definitions, clarifying goals of what restoration means, defining controls, defining baseline, defining indicators of success, which I think this is absolutely useful as a lesson learned for any country that wants to do any type of restoration. And also, I like the fact that you're becoming digital. You're having, and also this was the case for Brazil. Brazil gained a lot of international recognition and a lot of endorsement and accountability of the deforestation by putting this digital information through the Terra Amazon project available for the entire world. So I really hope Indonesia will do that, also available in English for other countries to be able to access that. That will be absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much. So our next speaker will be Pak Resal. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa. So, as an Indonesian, I think I must say that I'm very fortunate because our government really cares about the peatlands, and it makes work on the ground easier because we have a strong policy framework, and not only that, but also understanding and passion, as you can see from the Minister Siti's presentation and Pak Budi's. So our job here now is to implement it. Implement everything on the ground. So they provide the big picture, the vision, but we try to implement this on the ground. So I'm the CEO of PT Rimba Makmur Utama, which is the project developer of Katingan Mentaya project. This is the southern part of the concession. You can see there are some degraded peatlands with the forest in the background. So this is what we are trying to restore. Just a little bit of a background. Our goal is to reduce deforestation and provide sustainable development opportunities for communities. So we are an ecosystem restoration concession. We are not a timber plantation concession. We are not a palm oil concession. And I think Indonesia is a lead in this because there is such policy. I think it would be great if other countries have similar policies, maybe not restoration concession, maybe a conservation concession for peatlands in other countries, so that people like us, private sector, can take the opportunity to help manage these valuable resources. So as you can see, this is a partial map of Indonesia. Our project is that red dot over there. It's 150,000 hectares. Since we are in Europe, it's the size of Luxembourg. If we zoom in, we have 34 villages around, about 40,000 people. All the people in the villages are outside the concession. Our concession is the one designated as green, but we work in the area that is designated by this red boundaries, because we work also outside of our concession. In fact, most of our work are actually outside, because we believe that if we reduce the pressure, I think the forest can recover. Of course, we do things inside too, like planting and rewetting. As I mentioned before, this is an ecosystem restoration concession. We got the concession in 2013, one part of it, and then the second part we got in 2016. As a reminder, when we tried to apply for this concession in 2009, there is a similar concession application from industrial timber plantation. So I think the government, instead of giving it to industrial plantation, they decided to give us a chance. So we are very fortunate in that. I'll jump into what we actually do. There's something wrong with the format of the slides. But basically, our key activities and everything is presented in a very comprehensive way in this brochure. You can get it there. I just present some of the highlights. Our key areas is the fire prevention and mitigation. We start with risk analysis. We campaign with local authorities, and we involve communities in patrols, 400 patrols during fire season, patrolling basically 24/7. And we have highly trained firefighters on the ground when the fires actually happen, which is the skills that are very specialized. And we focus on community livelihood. We have microfinance program, mostly to women. We have worked with villages to secure additional protected area by securing village forests under the social forestry program. We provide alternative livelihood for ex-illegal loggers, ex-loggers too. We have a coconut sugar project. There's an existing 10,000 hectares coconut plantation, not palm oil plantation, but coconut plantation that is owned by the community, and we work on getting high value added products out of it. And we also do a lot of institutional strengthening. So basically, a lot of attention has been paid by Indonesian government at the village level. You can access village funds, but in order to access those funds, you have to have strong institution. So we think that it would be efficient if we focus on institutional strengthening so that we can leverage those resources. And of course, within the concession, we work on the restoration itself. We do canal blocking, obviously, to replant. We also replant native species, and not only planting, but also making sure that they still stay alive, they survive. And our survival rate is pretty good. We check every few months. Last time we checked, we have 85%, which is quite good, despite the lack of rain last year. We also experiment a lot with assisted national regeneration techniques, and we do biodiversity conservation protection. We do a lot of survey, inventory. We have placed a number of camera traps, and we're going to increase it to 100 camera traps this year. And in the future, we plan to set aside some of the area for orangutan sanctuary. This is where for orangutan that have been displaced from palm oil concession, and we can provide a home for those orangutans. When we do these activities, we have the SDGs in mind. So we track the indicators of the SDGs as a result of the activities. We align the indicators with the government indicators. We don't track all 17, but we track 9. So the ones that has color is the one that we track. The ones that's gray, the one that we are not tracking right now. This is, again, a more comprehensive picture of what we do. Again, you can see it in this brochure. Basically, we have a climate, community, and biodiversity goal. And these are our divisions, I guess, in our team. and the gray area there are the activities that we do. I wouldn't go into detail, but again, this is provided in this brochure. So I'm going to go straight to lessons learned. So it's too bad that the slide hasn't come out really well. I guess it's different formatting. But the first one is that we have to build trust with communities. That's the most important thing. And then there's no shortcut. So when we apply for permits, it takes 4 years. But before finally securing the concession, we start working with local communities and helping them with plannings with small projects. We have full-time community organizers on the ground to facilitate communications. And then everybody in the village has my phone number as a COO and our CEO phone numbers. So we have direct communications with them. It's really interesting when we give out the phone numbers, we thought that we would be inundated by calls, but not really. But we got calls when they feel that we need to hear something from the ground. And the second lessons learned is that it is important to show concrete benefits of conservation and restoration. So I have to be honest, what we're trying to do competes with the dominant narrative that is about short-term gains. So whenever we talk with the communities, the consistent question is about what happens in the short term. So we have to develop strategies that balance the two. The way we do it is that we have a policy to recruit locally, so at least some of them are employed. So 80% of our staff are actually local, 80% if not more. We have the community fire patrol programs. I mean, they may not be the highest skills, but we involve them, 400 people every year. So it's a labor-intensive, and by getting involved in our activities, they actually become ambassadors in their respective villages. And we provide microfinance. So these are the things that, it requires some financial resources, but it's something that you can do right away. And you don't have to necessarily jeopardize the long-term goal by having these short-term activities. These are the things that we can do, and then by having them involved in the beginning, then it feeds to the first lessons learned, which is building trust. The third is clarity of tenure is key. So I think we see a lot of maps, we see a lot of concession maps. The communities never saw them. They never saw them, so they don't know that this is a forest area, this is a forest area that can be converted, this is a non-forest area in terms of policy. They don't, so we take this seriously. We are very transparent when we do boundary setting. We involve everybody, but at the same time, we facilitated participatory village mapping before the boundary setting. So the villages already have an idea of their village boundary, and then when we set our boundaries, there is hardly any conflicts anymore because they know what's coming. The fourth lesson learned, I think this is mentioned in Minister Siti's various remarks, that it is important to look at institutions. So in our case, we focus on strengthening local institutions because, to be honest, they're the ones that we will collaborate for the 60 years of our concession. They are very permanent, the local institutions, more permanent than government agencies at the national level sometimes. So we focus on strengthening local institutions, and because then they become foundation of future collaboration. Number 5, investing in good science pays off. So we work with a lot of research organizations to test out various methodologies rigorously. We would like to instill that kind of discipline and curiosity among our staff, but also with the communities. And for example, there are local wisdom, local legends, like this happens here, this area is like this. We encourage communities to tell those stories, but we also then work with the scientists to explain this phenomenon that the communities observe. This way, we can have more attention giving to the importance of science. I think it's very, very important. And the sixth lessons learned is that we are, one of the largest ecosystem restoration concession. Our tenure is 60 years. So there are a lot of people who want to work with us. But the problem is some of these people have a limited funding cycle. We are dealing with long-term stuff, but a research project has 3 years funding cycle. Another one has 2 years. Everybody wants to test their methodologies. Everybody wants to test this LiDAR that you can carry on your backpack and this and that. But so it's important to take advantage of that, but it is important to start with shared principles, that these are things that we're not doing it just as a project, but these are the things that we will continue doing even though this research project is over technically. So that kind of stuff, we are very, I guess, adamant about it. We're very picky in picking partners just to ensure that there is a continuity. And one of the long-term partners we have is actually C4, who's been doing a lot of research on the ground with Daniel Murriarso, and they've been doing it for a long time. So these are the kind of partners that we focus. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pak Russell. Lots of very interesting points, and we will open 5 minutes of questions after Pak Watts, which is the head of sustainability implementation in Goldie, our resources. On the benefits of time, let's make sure we stick to our 10 minutes, please. Thanks very much. The floor is yours.
Sorry, actually, if it's okay, I'm a bit jet lagged, so it's better I'm standing. Good evening, everyone. I'm living in Indonesia since 10 years, but I'm not Indonesian, but it's, I would still like to share a perspective from a private sector company. This is the company I work for. It's called Golden Agri Resources. It's the industry many people at the moment love to hate, especially in Europe. So I'm having interesting discussions, but just to run you through a couple of numbers, we are operating 500,000 hectares of palm oil in Indonesia, only in Indonesia. We have less than 10% of our area is on peatland, approximately 40,000 hectares, of which 30,000 hectares is planted, and the rest is a conservation area. I think also interesting to mention, which is not really stated on the slides, is we are operating 150 clinics in very remote areas, and we are providing free education for 20,000 students around our concessions, ranging from elementary school until senior high school. The rest you can see, so we are operating in the entire supply chain, and we are contributing, I believe, 13 concessions or PTs, as we call it in Indonesia, which are under Bu Siti's peat restoration program. I think what is very important to see is that palm oil companies are long-term investors. Our rotation cycle is 25 years. And therefore, from an agronomic perspective, it's very important for us to manage the peatland. We are not interested in high subsidence rates. We are interested to maintain the peat as good as possible. Bu Siti is already gone, but I would disagree. We don't want to keep the peat wet. We want to keep the peat moist. I think that's a small differentiation, moist, because if it would be really wet, the palms don't like it, and if it's too dry also, but if it's moist, then it's great for palm and it's also still not burning. So I think very important from an agronomic perspective, peatland management will reduce the risk of flooding, and it will reduce yield losses from drought in the dry season if it's managed properly. Then for sure, we are a sustainable palm producer. We are RSPO certified, we are ISPO certified, and we want to sell low greenhouse gas palm to the European market, and therefore we are obviously also interested to minimize subsidence from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective. I think very important is really to be able to manage the peat properly. You need to understand what you are dealing with. And so this is just an example. It's one of our concessions in a district called Indragiri-Hulu in Riau province. And what you are seeing is essentially we are kind of in the middle of two large rivers where the peat is draining towards. And as you can see from the area, we are not alone there, right? You can see kind of on the south there are relatively large villages, many communities living there. You can see from the small little blue ditches, there is a lot of drainage going on in and around the area. And this is very important because whatever you do in your plantation, if you will influence what happens in these villages. And also the villages are influencing you in your concession because of the different drainage activities. I just want to share one example. So this is a concession which at some stage will need to be rehabilitated after the new government initiative. So we are close to the dome. And now the situation is like this. If we close our water gates in the dry season, the whole village which is lower than us will dry out in the dry season. And if we open the gates in the wet season, then all the villages will be flooded. So it's a very tricky situation for us to have that, to make sure that in this mini landscape we are operating, that the communities are not disadvantaged because of our water management approach. Okay, then so what you need to do a lot of investments into assessments, and these assessments need to be done on a regular basis and repeatedly, so you know exactly what you are working with. You need to know what type of peat it is. You need to understand where the water is running, in which direction, and you need to make sure that also you need to understand how is the water supplied, right? Some of the peatlands are flood-fed from the rivers, some are more groundwater based. If you have that information, you can make a drainability assessment to see how long actually you can manage your peat before it's permanently flooded. And based on that, you are developing a peat management plan. So just here a couple of examples. I think there is a topography assessment. Then we are doing called all the river assessments. You can see it's all the canals. I call it, it's our little Venice. We have around 400 kilometers of canals in that concession. All the transport from the fruit, from the people, everything runs on these canals. And we know each canal in which direction it flows and where we need to put the stop block to maintain a certain water level. And then I think what is also important, if you have all the information, you need to, peatland is a very complex ecosystem, and so you need to divide it into kind of digestible units which you can manage, but not forget the overall big picture. So in this case, we have kind of 5 different zones which can essentially managed independently from each other in respect of the water table. Also interesting, I think that leads also to the next slide, is our long-term subsidence rates. It's between 1 to 3 centimeters per year. That's kind of the long-term measurements since 2010. So then based on, if you have all that information, you can put the right infrastructure in place for managing and monitoring. As you see, it's relatively simple actually, the infrastructure. The water gates are a little bit more expensive, but the rest is built based on local materials. We have pumps also. We try to avoid using them, but in the dry season, if the peat is too wet, we pump water in to keep it moist. And then we have a large array different tools for monitoring. It's all, again, very basic. So we have some automated data loggers, which if there would be a telecommunication signal in the estate we are operating, it's supposed to transfer the data automatically actually now into the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, but we don't have a phone signal there, so we give them every month a memory stick with the data on it. We have other basic kind of piezometers for measuring the water table and subsidence poles to see the subsidence over time. Maybe interesting to know, I think the costs of something like this would be probably ballpark investment-wise $500,000 for one concession, plus then like 20 people who permanently monitor, because we have something in this concession, it's 7,000 hectares. We are having in every 30 hectare block, we have poles, subsidence poles and piezometers, so around 200 devices which need to be monitored every day. So it's quite a large amount of people who are driving around with motorcycles and to make the readings. So here, obviously, as I said, I think subsidence is quite important. What you see, that's an example. It's not from us. I took it from the literature. And what is obviously quite interesting is that in the early stages of a palm or plantation development, the subsidence rates are very high. I'm not sure. I think the science here or the researchers will know better than I do, but I believe it's actually not that it's really a CO2 emission in the beginning. I think it's more like a physical kind of compaction of the peat. Later on, when you are in the below 5 centimeter range, that is peat subsidence caused by decomposition of the peat. Still a significant number. I think it's pretty in line with our own measurements, 1 to 3 centimeters per year of peat subsidence, so significant amounts of biomass and consequently CO2, which is released from these concessions. I think then very critical for sure, Busiti has mentioned it, in areas which can be used for economic use going forward. I think companies plan to have multiple cycles on these peat areas, and so it's very important to understand the subsidence rates and to figure out how far away are you from this natural drainage limit, right? So it's like pure physics. How long, at what level does the water stop flowing to the river? Because if it's not flowing to the river anymore, essentially you are creating a lake in your concession, and you can increase the lifetime of that concession a bit if you are running pumps 24/7, essentially, which comes at a relatively high cost. So you don't want to do this. But this is for an important assessment to protect also the investment of our shareholders. So we make these assessments before replanting and then advise top management if these concessions can still operate 1 or 2 cycles of palm or not. And if not, obviously the recommendation is to rehabilitate, which then uses the tools and the techniques Paresa described in his previous concession. I think important, obviously, best practice management. I see many other companies who are smaller than GAR, Golden Agri Resources, and who have less funds and skills internally available. They need guidance. I think guidance is provided by the RSPO as an example. They are best management practice guidelines, which are jointly developed by NGO, CSO, TSO, and private sector. I think it's important to avoid confusion and clarity that the RSPO and ISPO is engaging with the governments, that there is a big alignment in these best practice manuals, and so that there is not a confusion from on the side of the people who need to implement those rules. Yeah, I think that's it from my side. In Bahasa, terima kasih, for your attention. I think it's important, really, a key takeaway, it's complex, and if you want to manage peat and use it in the long term, sort of in a sustainable manner, so if that is possible, you need to really understand the peat, and then you can minimize your emission. Thanks.
Thank you very much, but it's actually interesting to see the internal scheme of sustainability within a private sector. And I think the dialogue needs to be open between the public and the private sector. And I think there are companies who are doing great efforts to maintain, for their own interest, but also for the interest of corporate social responsibility and corporate social environmental approaches. So I think I'm very, very grateful that you came here, that you share with us these experiences, and to also share the importance of subsidence, that sometimes we kind of forget about this component and we focus more on emissions, right? But all this compactation of the land, and cities like Jakarta are currently, for different reasons, right? Because the drainage has been done for consumption instead of for plantations, but they are suffering from that as well. Let me open 5 minutes of questions to the public. So on the Indonesian, very interesting discussions. Some questions for 5 minutes, and then we'll move to quickly to Botswana and Peru. No questions. Do you have to?
Thank you. Lou Verso from the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. I guess my question is for Mr. Goetz. What you've shown is that there's really very little long-term sustainability. You eventually reach a point where it's no longer possible to cultivate. And you've put huge amounts of money into actually maintaining these areas cultivatable. Aren't there better long-term solutions outside of peatlands? And what can be done? I understand that a lot of the issues are associated with land tenure and access to land resources. And oil palm it's a lucrative crop. It's a long-term crop with good ground cover. It's a lot of things that you would want in a crop on mineral soils. What can be done to actually put you in a more sustainable situation on mineral soils so you can get access to the land that's required there and maintain the production there, so you're not required to go onto these peatlands where you still have fairly large greenhouse gas emissions, you have long-term sustainability issues, you have lots of capital that has to go into to set up this drainage infrastructure and maintain it, pump it and all that. So aren't there better solutions outside of peatlands, and wouldn't that help make your industry more sustainable in the long run?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. I think obviously I agree, right? I think peatland from an economic perspective is far away from mineral soils. You need more, not only the infrastructure, actually, you also need more fertilizers and so on, and soil treatments to pump up the pH level and etc. So it's more expensive than growing it on mineral soil. I think in Indonesia, I think there is an opportunity to look again into spatial planning. I think in the, unfortunately Bu Siti already gone, but I think in Indonesia there are large degraded areas within the so-called forest estate where since many decades there is no more tree, and these areas are currently not available for palm oil development from a legal perspective. I think there are opportunities where the government could consider to allow palm oil development on these areas in return of rehabilitating, restoring the peat areas. That would be an opportunity definitely welcomed by the palm oil industry. I think just maybe to describe also why did the industry initially go into palm is simply because there are not many people living there. And so tenure-related issues were so difficult that companies went into these also flat peatlands, which are easy to manage with large machines and not very heavy human interventions.
Another question?
Hi. I just have a question that's maybe a little sort of reverting back to the minister from Indonesia in a way, but about Brazil and the potential change, the president-elect there, and how that could potentially affect peatlands. I don't know if anyone here can address that or not, but...
I'm not sure if anyone in this room is in a position to answer this question, because I think it might be...
Sorry, if I maybe can...
Yeah, you can.
Not
Perfect.
that I'm
Go ahead.
But I think what is quite important is what Paresa said earlier. I think what is important if you want to manage peat, that you need to work with the local institutions, because the local institutions are there for the long term. Indeed, in governments, they change every 4 or 5 years. We don't know in Indonesia who will be the new president. Next year is election in April. We will see if the policies are currently continued. But if you work locally with the local communities, they know the peat, they are impacted by the peat, and I think with them you can achieve longer term solutions and don't worry too much about the government changes. I don't know, any comments from you?
Just maybe to briefly mention on the Brazilian, I've been working in Brazil for a number of years. I think the problem there is not so much peat, because the country is still very large, has a lot of area where concessions can be given. It's more about deforestation, right? So the problem, I think, is not so much on working on organic soils, and some areas maybe, but most of the problem has to do with deforesting for agro-businesses. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Hi, this is Joost Oorthuizen from IDH. I think we're making a lot of progress on peat, so it's great to be here. Can you give us a few numbers in terms of, I mean, you have done your homework over the last 3 years on how big is the issue and how big is the question. So what kind of dollars are we talking about to solve it? How many billions is it? And also your previous from Sinamas, I like your thought on this swapping thing, but developing a new plantation is what, $8,000 per hectare. So if you would throw it into your own company, what is the number that would take you out of peat?
Is the question clear?
Yes, maybe.
That's difficult to answer actually, because even when we talk about the availability of the data, for spatial data, for instance, there's around 10 to 12 US dollar per hectare if you do a complete and very sophisticated mapping, including the informations of the microhydrology using the LiDAR. But that's not the proper way of mapping the whole peatland that we have. The other offer is resulted or come out from the peat price that we have. It's around 0.5 to 0.7 US dollar per hectare. It's still a huge number of huge amount of money only to map out the existence of peatland, including the conditions of the peatland, how degraded it is or how intact it is, let alone to monitor what happens over those peatland. So we talk about millions and millions of US dollar, even only for mapping out those areas. Let alone when you look into when you deep dive into the areas that need restorations, you have to do it in the complete landscape level. You could not just do what Sinarmas do, make a beautiful, best available technology to manage or to maintain the hydrology of the concessions. While actually the water flows everywhere, the waters only follows one law, the hydrological law of the water. So as he also put an example or illustrations, even if his concessions could maintain the water as required by the law, the conditions of the village down below might really affect it in the dry seasons, because even in the canal there's no water. In the wet seasons, in the rainy seasons, they are flooded because of the overflows of the Peat. So you can ask him, a really tight water management requirement, the cost of that is still huge, even per hectare for the palm oil. So it's really a big question. The company still exists while the cost of the, not only the productions, but maintaining the hydrology is also high. So your questions is really valid. To change, to transform that to another place, what is required? Not only finding the areas, but also the administrative or the legal issues to change the status of the land from a forest state land into the area for plantation outside the forest-based industries. That's a huge, let alone to look for those areas. We can do remote sensing mapping and detailed mapping of the areas. But the transfer itself requires some cost. And no place in the areas, even if it looks like a degraded, without community already coming into the area, ex-HTI, ex-HPH, even if the concessions already abandon the land, the community just going inside on this area. It's a difficult situations, but it is not impossible. It is still possible. With the right regulations, with the right approach, engagement, putting evidence, and also outreach, it can be solved, actually. But to start where and to start how, that's a big question.
And it's also a lesson learned. It's much more expensive to restore than to preserve. Right?
Yes, that's
so
true.
on the benefit of time, let's move to the next panels. And you, for the economic question, very brief one.
Maybe just to throw out some figures, I think if we would do that in our case, I think 40,000 hectares, we would ballpark look, $400 million. I think that's the figure what we need, right? That is needed to build a new plantation. But I think more important also what Pabudi mentioned, I think to rehabilitate then the existing peat and kind of ensure that in the long term it's there, because indeed the communities will go in and encroach if it appears unmanaged. I think that is also a cost which comes, $2,000 to $3,000 so in total per hectare. So that's on top of the new development costs in the other places. So.
Thank you very much. We're going to make a change of panels, and in this change we're going to have Botswana with ecotourism, and we're going to have first Peru with their management. Thank you very much, the Indonesian colleagues. Let's make a change of panel. And in this shift we're going to give the... Thank you. A little comment on the Brazilian case. I'm going to ask the next speakers to be as brief as possible.
Sorry, just a very quick comment on Brazil. I think whether the new government's going to be better or worse than the previous government, the jury's still out. But what is certainly true is that very large areas of peat have been drained in Brazil over the last couple of decades, and it hasn't been recorded, and the emissions haven't been recorded. But there are large areas of drained peat in Brazil.
In which parts of Brazil? Thanks very much. So, thank you. For plantation or for livestock? Rice. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Time is running short. I'm sorry. We're going to ask the speakers to be on time, please. But it's very interesting to have also the overview of the Peruvian Amazon and to have the overview of the Okavango Delta, particularly with ecotourism and with hydrological challenges on that part of Africa as well. So we're going to start with al señor Alberto Paniagua, which now I've lost my affiliation. I'll give you with Denise del Castillo, exactly, which is a researcher and the head of the Forest and Management Program in IAP, which is the Institute for Sustainable Research in the Peruvian Amazon. The floor is yours.
May I have your... Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, especially when the invitation comes to talk about what I like the most, to preserve and manage the Amazon forest and basically peatlands. How do you call this one? Okay, first of all, I guess everybody's in the same track. Peru, Congo, and Indonesia. We know that we have a lot of peatlands. And when we go back about 15 years ago, it was quite difficult to convince people that we really need to manage Okay. Okay, thank you. That we really need to manage the peatlands and how to preserve the peatlands, because nobody believes it. I'm talking about the Peruvian conditions. When we're talking about those areas, everybody say, well, you are a little crazy. Why you have to take care about those land, that wasteland that we have over there? I really believe that we really need it, so we did research. So we found that really we have a big patch of peatlands in the Amazon. Go ahead, please. So that's the reality. We are talking about Loreto, that's the biggest state in Peru, and we have about 3.1 gigatons of, which is equivalent of 60 years of Peruvian national anthropogenic CO2 emission. So that's a big issue for Peru. So we started talking about how to manage that piece of land. And we did some advance. We did a lot of work, but we need to do a lot yet. Please. We have wildlife there. There is no necessity to talk about each species, but we have a lot. Please go. But also, that's a point, we have people who depend on wetlands to obtain the natural resources. We have fishing, we have agriculture, we have forestry, and a lot of transportation depends on wetlands. And I want to mention something. I've been in several meetings about peatlands. What they talk the less is fishing. As I believe almost everybody is forester, a lot of people is agriculturists, but fishing, I believe that's a very important component in the whole formula, because fishing is proteins for local people. Fishing is money for local people. So we have to talk about that. If we want to look in the complex way that we have to go. If we don't talk about stomach necessities, and we don't talk about pocket necessities, well, we are missing a very important component in terms of peatland management. Please go ahead. In the Peruvian conditions, my institution, IAP, look for how to find different economic conditions for local people. And we are lucky, we have different fruits that are they need to do research. We need to do research in order to know how to grow better those rich fruits. For example, we have camu camu. This is a Myrsaria dubia, a flaudetorian, very rich in vitamin C. In the past, people depend on natural stands. After 30 years of research, we know exactly how all the agronomic necessities, how to manage, how to have plantation under those conditions with camu camu. Right now, it's a cash crop, a very important cash crop. Please go ahead. And also, the star. The aguaje tree, aguaje palm. We call a fruit aguaje palm. Has a very rich vitamin A. It's there. We have almost 3 million hectares that people depend on that fruit. The point is how to manage well those aguajales, those plant. I will not say in plantation, but those aguajales stands that are there. There are about 5,000 families who depend directly from that tree. In the past, it used to be cut. You want to harvest those fruits, but that's why research is important. We teach people how to harvest without killing those very important palms in order to harvest those aguaje fruits. Please go ahead. And it's there. I will say there is not a plant over there in the Peruvian forest that has a gender equity between women and men. We're talking about that very important aguaje fruit in the Amazon. Please go ahead. And also, in terms of management, those huge 3 million aguajes, women start playing a big role. It looks very, very easy. Why not to climb a tree? How to cut? But that was the tradition. In the past, when there was not a lot of pressure, of course, killing one plant or two plants, it was not a big issue in terms of environmental and causing depletion to the environment. But also when we have a lot of a market, we have right now a market, so there is a lot of aguajes that need to be cut. So it's not cut anymore, it's harvest. So it's an activity, basically not only for men, but also for women. Please go ahead. And also, we have to manage the natural resources. We have trees. For example, we call it the capirona, Colicophyllum sprucianum. It's a fast-growing timber species. It goes all over. It's just a matter of the silviculture in flooded forests, and also in peatland is completely different than the silviculture in upland land. That's why the research has to be together in order to do good conservation, because that's a mistake that we always do. We believe that capirona can grow in upland soils. It will be exactly the same in lowland. The silviculture is completely different. And the thing is, the local people know it. We are learning from them. We are learning that silviculture from them. Of course, applying science to understand better how to manage, how the silviculture and those conditions are. Please go ahead. In terms of opportunities, of course, doing a very responsible scientific management, we're going to improve food security for local population. There is no doubt about that. Increase the biobusiness opportunities, strengthen women empowerment, ensure biodiversity conservation, fortify effective methods of mitigation and adaptation to climate change. Why it's very important? We're working with those plants. Just an example, I mentioned camu camu, capirona, aguaje, because those plants, they tolerate flooded conditions, but also grow in upland soils. So they can adapt it quite well when we have drought, when we have excessive flooded conditions. This is the reality. I believe that's a tremendous opportunity that we have improved, that we have here in Indonesia, and also in Congo, other countries in the world, that we have to put together all that knowledge, local knowledge, agronomists, forester, biologists, if we want to manage well the peatland soil. Because, of course, we have to learn from Indonesia, the experience they have over there, no? In order not to have some mistakes, in order to preserve the Amazonian in a very nice way, managing the natural resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Alberto Paniagua. He is the prior executive director of Profunampe, which is the largest trust fund of Peru, and is the Peruvian Trust Fund for Natural Parks and Protected Areas. The floor is yours. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to this forum. And I come indeed from Peruvian Trust Fund for National Parks and Protected Areas. And we are supporting, during the last 25 years, we have been supporting government efforts in order to make biodiversity conservation, especially within protected areas. And we are not specialized, as my colleague, in peatlands, but we decided to work in the Amazon region, supporting the indigenous people in a pilot project, which is the first ever approved project by the Green Climate Fund. And this is a very emblematic project for us, and we are, this project is called Building Environmental, Social, and Cultural Resilience within the province of Daten del Marañón. It's a very, in very different ways. This is the location. This is in the northern Amazon region, in the province of Daten del Marañón. As Dennis said, the carbon stock, this is a real, very rich carbon deposit in the Amazon region. And let me confess that when we decided to do this project with those communities, we didn't know that we were going to work in a peatland. We just knew that we were going to work with them, supporting them in order to have a sustainable exploitation of natural resources. When we were at the designing stage of the project, we discovered that we were dealing with a peatland. You know, it's a very complex project. As you can see there, we have 7 different indigenous peoples, which means at the same time 7 different languages, and in some way 7 different cultures. And they, you know, they share a territory where the peatlands are a vast surface of the Amazon region, but at the same time they also have water. The biggest lake in the Amazon region in Peru, the Lago Rimachi, is located in the area of this project. It's a very challenging project. It has already 2 years of implementation, and the lifespan is 5 years, and we already have some lessons learned. But this is a place, as you can see in the slide, a very poor side of our country. Well, the goals of this project are that to improve the resilience of the indigenous communities that are living in the carbon-rich wetlands and peatlands in the Daten del Marañón. And the idea is to reduce at the same time the greenhouse effect of gas resulting from deforestation. Let me tell you, the idea of this project is to create, and that was remarked by the GCF, by the Green Climate Fund, to create a synergies between conservation and climate change activities. So that's why it is also a pilot project. Well, our expected impacts are not very big, because this is a pilot project, but we are estimating that 4,700 hectares of forest we are going to avoid deforestation in that area, and more than 4,000 people will improve their resilience, and more than 300,000 hectares of forests of aguajales and peatlands they will improve their resilience. Well, this is as you can see that's the landscape of the wetlands and peatlands in the project area, and it is in most of this area remains intact, but the threats are there. as you may understand. The threats are there, and what we are doing with the project is to prevent, is to foresee what is coming to the area, and to work with the local communities to, to face those threats. As you know, threats to carbon stocks come from deforestation. You know better than me. In the area, one of the threats is not only the deforestation itself, but also the progress of palm oil plantations. So that we are going to work with the communities to avoid that threat. Also, we have floods and infrastructure projects. That's something that our communities also are facing. And the idea with this project is that to work with communities with some principles. One of the lessons learned is that when we went to this area, we had some principles to work with them and to verify if those principles were going to help us to make successful this project. One of the principles was, and we talked with the communities and saying, we are here to support you in exchange, objectively, in exchange of nothing. Why so? Because they experienced it over time, companies, people, even the government coming to their territory and saying, I'm gonna give you some support, but in exchange you're gonna give me your trees, you're gonna give me your water or whatever. So our principle was to say, we are not going to ask you anything in exchange. Second principle, we are here to support your activities that you have been doing for centuries. We're not going to change that. What we're going to do is to support you in giving you facilities to better do what you have ever been doing. One of the ideas in the area, we did something similar to what Dennis talked to you about, is, for instance, these people used to cut the palm trees to harvest the aguajal. Well, we decided to introduce, the climbing techniques, and successfully, because the communities, they realized very easily that they didn't need to cut the trees, and that they were going to have more trees and more aguaje, which is a very important for them. So, and some other thing that we did with them is, this is your territory. One of the ways to keep your territory as natural as possible is using a technique which is called protected area. We discussed with them, and finally we have 2 protected areas for around 300,000 hectares, working with them in order to, face the threats that we had in the territory. And but they are doing what they have always been doing. That's our lessons learned, And the idea is that, and one of the lessons learned for us is that people, I don't know if you know the famous anthropologist, French anthropologist, Claude Lévi-Strauss. He has a very nice book which is called The Savage Mind. This is no other than a very sharp irony, because he discovered, as we have discovered with our people, that the indigenous people, they have a knowledge that sometimes is maybe in some cases more important than the Occidental or knowledge. Lévi-Strauss, he had a friend in one of the tropical forests where he used to work. He was a very good friend of him, and he said once, this man knows about the name, the properties, and the location of about 500 plants. And he said, if he were in Europe, he would be a scientist. Yes. And what we have discovered, and that's there's a learn with this community, that they know very well how to manage the forest, they know very well how to manage the water. And in general, the water regime, the rains, but they needed, you know, some facilities that we are providing them.
Thank you very much, Senor Paniagua. I think we need to
Yes,
finish
well,
it here.
this is, and the next step would be to work with them, the bio-businesses. That's the milestone for the future with them, which are about to implement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to have to close our session here. We just went out of time. I'm just, for courtesy for the Botswanan colleagues, I'm going to ask you not to present your slides, but in 5 minutes maximum, can you please give us your lessons learned of what are the important management practices that you could share with us for the Botswana region? Okay, sorry about that. We're going to close. They also need to close, so we are going to have our final 5 minutes and then open if someone has one question. And I thank the audience for staying with us for so long. Thanks very much. So Botswana, could you please, Professor Baiwa, and apologies for this, the time became really, really short. So maybe just the lessons learned that you could share with us for the Botswana Okavango region then.
Okay, thank you very much. Am I? Okay. Thank you very much. The Okavango Delta is a wetland. It's not a peatland per se. So what has been happening in the Okavango Delta is that it's a tourist destination where we have a lot of tourists coming from all over the world. So in order to manage this wetland with all these tourists coming, the government has come up with a number of policies, a number of strategies to manage the wetland. This includes the Okavango Delta Management Plan. This includes the tourism policy, also includes the wildlife conservation policy. The conservation policy actually led to the Okavango Delta being divided into concession areas. So each concession area now has its own management plan. And there are also standards. What you have to do as a tourism operator in each of the concession areas is that you have to manage your tourism activities and properties as per standards released by government. So this on its own has resulted in a situation whereby there is sustainability in the management of the Okavango Delta. Government has adopted policies which are informed by the sustainable development perspective, ideals, so the sustainable tourism being practiced in the Okavango Delta. So this on its own has actually led to a situation whereby the sustainability communities have been brought in to benefit from ecotourism through the community-based natural resource management policy. So in reality, what we can say is that there is sustainability in the management of all the natural resources that are found in the Okavango Delta. It's also a Ramsar site. It's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. What I'm trying to say is that the international community has also come in the form of protocols, agreements, and the like, which are actually helping in the sustainability of the Okavango Delta. You said in 5 minutes. I think I took
That was
4.
wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was perfect. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, it's around 16% of the GDP from Botswana comes from the ecotourism.
Yes, actually, tourism is the second largest economic sector in the country. There's diamond mining and then tourism. Hence, really, we have to take care of our tourism to make it sustainable.
And this is an amazing example of how you can get benefits of preserving the peats. So, Peter, so sorry, you're getting also 5 minutes.
Very, very, very tricky. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sticking with us for so long. I wanted to give some sort of researcher's perspective. I'm a hydrologist working at a research institute, and I would like to differ from Joseph in saying that I'm not entirely sure whether those objectives of sustainability are implemented properly. It all looks good on paper. When we look at where the system is going, it's not going in the direction of sustainable utilization. For sure not when we look at not just the Okavango Delta, but if we look at the Delta and the catchment. And the key words there to achieve that is, there are a couple of things, that I just listed a couple of them. It's a vision. I'm not sure whether we have a vision of managing a system, a complex system, where we have, that spans countries, that spans climatic regions, that spans hydrological processes, then what we need for that is creativity and passion. And all those processes that are happening so far, they lack those. They are good on paper, they follow rules, they follow everything, but that creativity, something that we've heard earlier, it is necessary to come up with creative solutions where we can merge things, and the vision and realize that vision is sometimes missing. And another keyword is negotiated compromise.
Is what, sorry?
Negotiated compromise. Compromise. That's necessary to achieve, and it's impossible to do that to achieve sustainability in any way without having that vision. And yeah, that's essentially what I want to talk about.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think we had very interesting perspective of the Peruvian colleagues who have a very different definition of what degradation is. For them, degradation has to do with harvesting above ground biomass by removing the trees, the aguaje trees, which has absolutely nothing to do with the definition of degradation of hydrological effects in Indonesia. So here we have two very different examples of how definitions play a role. And also we have very interesting another example with the ecotourism sections of how understanding monitoring of sustainability and defining what is the control and what the indicators of success can make a difference between a perception and a quantified assessment. I think these are absolutely valuable ideas that put into example how this South-South dialogue and also understanding which species are working well in certain peatlands in other parts of the world could be interesting business also for other continents under certain safeguard conditions. Thank you very much. I'm going to give, because you've been waiting for so long.
Can I have a minute, a second? Just I want to say in terms of challenges that we have in the Peruvian peatlands. The main challenge is the land tenure. We have to solve that problem. If we don't have a land tenure clearly, we're going to have a big problem in the future.
Land tenure has been the topic of restoration all around the world. And I would say that also includes the process of degradation and restoring degraded land. Let me open the floor for two questions. Of maybe the audience also has the right to make any question. Unless I think we're all very tired. Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, I'm Peter van Dijk. I lived a lot in Africa and Asia. Yes, creativity is needed, but registration is needed too. And this jurisdictional approach is not always explained very well. And the massive work that Indonesia has been doing, I mean, 17,000 islands, I think many more ethnics and languages than you can imagine in Peru, for instance. Yeah. This massive challenge is what? Get one map of the area and everybody an electronic identity card, EKTP it is called. Everybody, every forest person. And that is very important. And then you can think about all the rest. Because if somebody's not registered, you cannot protect. That's the Martin Luther King in Salem lesson that we all should take to our heart. And to not glorify the informal culture of indigenous peoples. We all want them to be happy, but many of them now have a life expectancy of less than 40 years or something. And maternity death and birth, it's all very terrible. And it's all because they are informal. They depend on charity for the moment. And I hope that everybody looks at the work that is being done in Indonesia and how massive it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other question, comment? Thank you, Diana. And we're going then to close this event. Thanks very much.
Thanks. I just wanted to thank everyone here, you, Rosa, and the troopers in the room. We are also wanting to be very appreciative of the teams here that are recording. We have a huge following online, and we'll be repeating the messages. So please do share your slides. We'll put it online on our Global Peatlands Initiative website. Thanks, everyone. Peatlands are really important. They matter, and we just really need to carry this momentum forward in this partnership and continue to share. Thank you so much.
Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, the staff, for staying here with us so late. Thank you.